George Anthony DeVolder Santos. Convicted every day in the court of public opinion for fashion crimes by wearing sweaters with his suits every single day. And now alleged to have committed 13 federal crimes in the Eastern District of New York. Who is this international man of mystery? This alleged felon with questionable fashion sense? And what's he accused of? Let's dive in. George Santos is an American citizen. That much we can say for certain. He may have been born in Brazil or the United States, but he's repeatedly avoided clarifying his place of birth for reasons that are unexplained. Nevertheless, he went through primary and secondary school in Queens, New York. He lived in Brazil from 2008 to 2011. The circumstances of him moving back to the United States in 2011 are odd. He was accused of check fraud in Brazil, but failed to appear in court in 2011, leaving the case open for over a decade. After moving back to the US in 2011, he bounced around jobs before running as a Republican for New York's 3rd Congressional District in 2020. Now, he lost to the incumbent, Thomas Suozzi, but not badly. And in 2022, Suozzi announced he wouldn't run for re-election. Santos decided to run again, and this time against a non-incumbent.
George, do you have an honest moment inside of you ever when you're campaigning?
And in November of 2022, Santos won in what some people called a mild upset. The stories that Santos told on the campaign trail started unraveling in late December 2022, when the New York Times published a long investigation. What followed, though, was often stranger than fiction, a seemingly endless string of new revelations. He said he worked for Citigroup and Goldman Sachs, despite them having no records of him doing so. He claimed to be a star college volleyball player. He even allegedly stole a dog from an Amish dairy farmer. To his very minor credit, Santos has admitted to making some misleading claims about his education and financial status and apologized for it.
I made a mistake, and I think humans are flawed.
But he continues to deny the more serious allegations. Meanwhile, the Brazilian government publicized his whole open check fraud case, and Santos managed a civil compromise that closed the criminal case down there. As the story swirled, Santos showed up for his job in Congress and swore nothing would stop him from doing his job. Despite several fellow Republicans calling for his resignation from Congress, Santos vowed to run for re-election.
It's a great day to be an American, it's a great day to be a Republican, and it's a great day to announce re-election.
On May 9th, news broke that federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York had filed a sealed indictment against Santos.
We just saw Matt Gaetz survive a massive scandal. He's elected. We see members of Congress survive scandal upon scandal.
When confronted by the media, Santos actually seemed surprised by the news. But it quickly became apparent that he would show up the next day in the Eastern District to be arraigned. On May 10th, Santos was arraigned in federal court. The indictment was unsealed. It contains 13 criminal counts, including wire fraud, unlawful monetary transactions over $10,000, theft of public money, and false statements. Those 13 counts basically capture 3 separate but related criminal schemes. First, defrauding campaign contributors. Second, unlawfully obtaining unemployment benefits. And 3, lying to Congress about his finances. Let's start with the first, defrauding campaign contributors. This scheme is the most complex, involves the most money, and is covered by the first 8 of the 13 counts in the indictment. Here's the gist. Federal prosecutors allege that Santos lied to 2 people to get them to make what they thought were political contributions to a company Santos actually controlled, and then Santos took that money from the company for his own personal use, buying luxury designer clothes and paying off credit card bills. Again, I have to question the luxury designer clothes allegation when he's wearing a sweater under a suit jacket every single day. But I will let the federal prosecutors deal with that particular factual incongruity. I don't think it's essential to the case. Now, this campaign donation scheme almost certainly starts with a company called Redstone Strategies, LLC. The indictment doesn't name the company that Santos used to get the campaign contributions, calling it only Company Number 1. But there's good reason to believe that Company Number 1 is in fact Redstone. The indictment describes Company Number 1 as a Florida LLC formed on November 1st, 2021, with its principal place of business in Merritt Island, Florida, and with 2 authorized managers, one of which was DeVolder Organization, LLC. Sure enough, Redstone Strategies was an LLC registered to an address in Merritt Island, Florida on November 1st, 2021, and listed the DeVolder Organization as one of the managing officers. And as the name would suggest, the single authorized manager of the DeVolder Organization was George Santos. It's also worth pointing out that Redstone Strategies was voluntarily dissolved on January 25, 2023, just 3 weeks after Santos was sworn into Congress. Federal prosecutors allege that Santos caused a person identified only as person number 1 to communicate with 2 potential donors, contributor number 1 and contributor number 2. Those communications stated that Redstone Strategies was a 501c4 organization, that donors could contribute unlimited amounts of money, and that the money would be spent on advertisements in support of Santos's candidacy. Now, again, while the contributors were not named in the indictment, the New York Times has identified them as Raymond Tantillo and Andrew Intrater, 2 wealthy businessmen. Apparently, in response to Person 1's communications, both Tantillo and Intrater each made what they thought were political donations to Redstone Strategies. Each gave $25,000.
Look, I don't have a number in my head. The fact that I'm having these are conversations I never in a million years thought I would be having. But when in Rome, let's have the conversations.
So why was the assurance that Redstone was a 501c4 organization important? Well, 501c4 organizations are so-called social welfare organizations governed by special IRS rules. You can't write a donation to a 501c4 off your taxes like a 501c3 nonprofit, but they are tax exempt and they don't have to disclose their donors. Most importantly, they can engage in politics. Their major purpose can't be to elect candidates to office. So, generally speaking, they can spend up to 49.9% of their budget on candidate election work. But they are frequently used to funnel money into election campaigns through so-called dark money contributions. Remember, the donors don't have to be disclosed. The problem for Santos, of course, is that Redstone was not registered with the IRS as a 501c4 organization. Oops. Deduce a transfer of money from those 2 wealthy businessmen that they wouldn't have otherwise done. That is what the law calls a scheme to defraud. And since it was done over interstate wires, bingo, wire fraud. Actually, 5 separate wire fraud counts for 5 separate emails and text messages to those businessmen. Those are the first 5 charges in the indictment. What happened next? Well, according to the feds, the very same day each of those supposed contributions were made, Santos transferred the money from Redstone Strategies to and between his own personal bank accounts. Those transfers from Redstone to his bank accounts and between his bank accounts constitute the unlawful monetary transactions in counts 6, 7, and 8. The second criminal scheme in the indictment relates to unemployment benefits. And this one is fairly simple. On June 17th of 2020, Santos applied to receive unemployment benefits through the New York State Department of Labor. Those benefits were funded through the federal government during the COVID-19 pandemic through the CARES Act and administered by New York's Department of Labor. In his June application, Santos claimed to have been unemployed since March 22, 2020, and he kept recertifying every single week his unemployment status through April 15th of 2021. In total, the feds say that Santos took over $24,000 in unemployment insurance benefits. The problem? According to the feds, Santos was employed that entire time as a regional director at an investment firm with a salary of about $120,000 per year. Oops, simple mistake. Who among us hasn't done such a thing?
I've made a huge mistake.
After he was arraigned, Santos actually had the gall to complain to the media that the unemployment benefits issue was confusing at the time.
You keep extending the unemployment benefits.
The irony, of course, is that on April 6th of this year, Santos became a leading co-sponsor of a Republican bill that its supporters say will help states recover unlawfully obtained unemployment insurance benefits through the CARES Act. Just no notes. Count 9 of the indictment alleges theft of public money in an amount greater than $1,000. Now that more or less covers the entirety of the unemployment benefits fraud. Interestingly, counts 10 and 11 allege wire fraud for Santos applying for those benefits on 2 separate occasions a week apart in January 2021. Remember, he had to recertify his employment on a weekly basis from June 2020 to April 2021. So why only the 2 wire fraud charges in January? My guess, and this is only a guess, is that on those 2 occasions, Santos had his unemployment benefits sent to a different bank account than he normally did. One that required crossing state lines and thus having the interstate nexus that federal wire fraud requires. Every kind of income and liability Knowingly and willfully falsifying a financial disclosure statement is a crime. It's a false official statement in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001. George Santos filed the required financial disclosure statements during his 2020 and 2022 congressional campaigns. How'd he do?
Not great, Bob.
In his 2020 financial disclosure statement, Santos said that he earned $55,000 from a single company, when, in fact, according to the feds, he earned only about $27,000 from that company, but $25,000 from his investment firm. Remember, the investment firm he was employed at while he was claiming unemployment benefits. Yeah, that one. So while the total amount of income is about the same, he failed to accurately report the sources of his income. That failure constitutes the false statements charge in count 12. In his 2022 financial disclosure statement, things get extra weird. This statement covers 2021 and 2022 up to the reporting date. Among other things, Santos said that his income was $750,000 in salary from the DeVolder organization and between $1 and $5 million in dividends from the DeVolder organization with no other sources of income. He also claimed to have over $1 million in certain bank accounts. In fact, according to the feds, during that time frame, he received $28,000 from his old investment firm and $20,000 in unemployment insurance payments. And that's it. He didn't have $1 million in any bank account. Those false statements are count 13, the final count of the indictment. Okay, wait, so I lied. There's actually more than just 13 counts in the indictment. After count 13, there are 2 allegations of something called criminal forfeiture. Not civil forfeiture, criminal forfeiture. All that needs to be said about those allegations is this. If the federal government proves the criminal counts, they want the money back. That's it. So those are the allegations in the indictment. But what are the potential consequences for Santos? That's one of the first questions any criminal defendant has for their lawyer. What am I charged with, and what am I facing? There are plenty of collateral consequences for being a felon, for example, but for many defendants, the real question is whether they're going to prison and for how long. If you listen to most media outlets, you'll hear that Santos could face up to 20 years in prison. That's partly due to the DOJ's press release, which very clearly states that Santos faces a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison for the top counts. Now that is legally true, and it's a nice big number that makes for a good headline. But it's incomplete and, frankly, a little bit misleading. It's also frustratingly common in media coverage of criminal cases. Sentences in federal court follow the federal sentencing guidelines, which is determined by the United States Sentencing Commission. Those guidelines were intended originally to be binding on federal judges, but the U.S. Supreme Court struck that down in United States v. Booker in 2005. Federal judges are still required to consult the sentencing guidelines, and a sentence imposed through the proper application of the guidelines is presumed to be reasonable. A federal judge can still, in their discretion, depart from the guidelines, both upwards and downwards, but they have to explain on the record why. And they don't get that presumption of reasonableness. The core of the sentencing guidelines is the sentencing table. The horizontal axis is the defendant's criminal history category, and the vertical axis is the offense level. So if you have, say, a criminal history category 3 and an offense level 22, the presumptive sentence is 51 to 63 months in prison. The higher the criminal history category, or the higher the offense level, the higher the presumptive sentence. Each federal crime has a base offense level. You can then add or subtract to that base offense level under certain circumstances. So let's take wire fraud. Wire fraud has a base offense level of 7. But if the loss as a result of that wire fraud exceeds, say, $15,000, then you add 4 to the base level 7 and get 11. And that's just the very beginning. There are all sorts of upwards and downwards adjustments that can be made depending on the nature of the crime, certain characteristics of the victim, the defendant's role in the crime, etc. You can even get 2 to 3 points knocked off for accepting responsibility and pleading guilty. And things get even more complicated when you have multiple offenses and a single charging instrument like Santos does. So look, the federal sentencing guidelines are long. They are detailed. They are, frankly, arcane. And that's why the media usually just repeats the maximum possible sentence language instead of diving into the guidelines. Let's get back to the original question then. What is George Santos looking at in this case? My quick and dirty guess, as low as 1.5 to 3 years in prison. And for those who want to check my work at home, I'm assuming a criminal category of 1 and a combined offense level somewhere around 15 to 19. Of course, where he falls in or around that range will depend on any number of factors. I could be way off. I don't know. Devin asked a state prosecutor to talk about federal crimes. It's his fault. Give me a break. While my guess of 1.5 to 3 years in prison might sound low to some people, keep in mind that that is a fair chunk of time for a person to spend incarcerated. And this may just be the first of many criminal cases that Santos faces.
And would you stop taking pictures of yourself? Your sister's going to jail.
It also reflects something unmistakably true about George Santos. To paraphrase Stephen Attewell, if he's a crook, he's a cheap crook. The crimes he's alleged to have committed in this case are serious, and they're high profile because of who he is. But they aren't particularly complex or far-reaching. The campaign donation scheme was simple. It was a basic con job. And lying to get $24,000 in unemployment insurance is, while shockingly hypocritical for him specifically, it's also just lame.
I know, sir, and I'm a very level-headed individual.
Lame for a man who has spent so much time trying to puff up his personal and financial credentials to impress other people. And as far as at least his 2022 false statements to Congress are concerned, he's probably just trying to look rich, puff up his image, get more donations. I guess what I'm trying to say is this. We deserve better criminals. If his story were a TV show, he'd maybe get 2 seasons. George Santos is like gas station coffee disguised in an